Good morning and very warm welcome to everyone. It is my privilege to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Somdev Kar. Dr. Kar is an associate professor at Indian Institute of Technology, Ropar. He earned his PhD in linguistics from Eberhard Karls University of Tübingen, Germany, and his MA in applied linguistics from the University of Hyderabad. Prior to joining IIT Ropar, he worked as the Leibniz Center for General Linguistics, JAS, Berlin, Germany, as a research associate and at CIL Mysore as a fellow, and later as a visiting faculty at Qatar University, Qatar. His research interests lie in the field of phonetics and phonology, optimality theory, distributed morphology, evolutionary linguistics, and NLP. He published a book and several research articles in internationally acclaimed journals. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kar. Dr. Kar, over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gulab. I would like to extend my thanks first to Dr. Gulab Chand and, of course, my mentor and very respected professor, Udanaran Singh. Should I start with the slides or?
Yeah, sure,
Okay.
sure.
Thank you. So welcome to all of you who have joined this webinar. I have picked a topic which is not very deep in the area of phonology, but we will try to touch some of the recent research areas that are happening in phonology, in language, in terms of sound, speech, and so. So the name that is related to a continent, that is Africa. So let us start with the story behind it. So I'll start with a blank page actually. So what we are going to look into today is how we are speaking certain words in terms of the syllables and the theoretical assumptions that are working behind it, and so let's say our pronunciation for this word today is Africa. Now all of you, if you just look at this word and try to think how you actually pronounce it. Being an Indian, I believe most of you are from India itself, and maybe from different linguistic background, from different native language background. But still, you will notice that all of us have certain uh, tendency to pronounce this word and many similar words. If we pronounce it in a normal fluid conversation, it sounds like Africa or to some Africa, right? Now, if we actually break it, go a little bit into the depth, it sounds like Af, then free, and then Ka. So these are three syllables, but actually in our that in phonological terms, what we call in the deep structure, in deep down, we think that we are pronouncing it more like F, then Re, and then Ka. Now, this is not very unusual for any speaker around the world. We think that we are pronouncing something, and actually, when the speech actually manifests, it comes out to be something slightly different. That's where all these phones, allophones, and many other phonological things happen. Now, we are going with the assumption that language is primarily spoken. Of course, keeping in mind there is sign language and many other forms of linguistic expression. But here, what we are trying to look at, some of the common traits that we see in the pronunciation of this kind of words. Now, our whole talk is not about Africa, of course. It is about something else. It is about the phonological basis for this kind of pronunciation variation, the difference that what we are thinking and what we are actually pronouncing, and so have you ever looked at how it is actually pronounced? Because that variation from this or this is very evident if you actually look at some recorded data in the Indian subcontinent actually. So it is mainly influenced by our native language, our practice, our general linguistic environment. Many things are there, but one thing that does not change, that our way of pronouncing this kind of words differ a lot from the native speakers of English. When even if we look at this example, the same word is borrowed in German, and in German also the pronunciation is not much different from the English. Now let us very quickly try to listen to this pronunciation. I couldn't have a downloaded version, so let me try to play it from the Collins dictionary. And see, this is the British pronunciation.
Africa.
Let me play it once again.
Africa.
Okay, and if you look at the actual the other one, the German pronunciation, I guess it is here. Oops, sorry. Okay, so here is the American pronunciation.
Africa. Africa.
Right, and of course the German one here.
Africa. Africa.
Okay, now compared to this, when we come to India, the pronunciation vary to some extent, and we'll discuss why it is.
Africa.
So this is a sub course and online Hindi dictionary where the pronunciation is coming more like
Africa.
okay. And if you look at the Microsoft's pronunciation pattern,
Africa. Africa.
okay. So I guess now you get an idea where it differs. It differs in these areas. So in Hindi, it sounds more like sorry. It sounds more like af and then free and then ka. Whereas the native speakers of English, the native speakers of German, their pronunciation mode is more like a followed by free and then ka. So what I'm trying to tell here is that we are getting one extra for here. So our pronunciation is more like af and then free and then ka. Whereas the native speakers, they're not getting that additional one. They're rather making it a free ka. Of course, there is a third possibility, which is we just break it to af, then re, and then ka. Frankly speaking, none of the Indians pronounce this way. None of the research results show that. We tend to pronounce this one, while the native speakers of English, German, Dutch, most of these European languages, they pronounce it this way. Of course, the speakers from Africa itself, they also pronounce it this way mostly. Now, let us come to the phonological theory part. What we call this thing? This thing, that doubling of that fa sound, is called gemination. So this kind of fa cluster in Africa, okay, so they are called the geminates. So if you take a typical definition, a geminate is a consonant that has contrastively longer duration than its singleton counterpart. So basically, the time that takes, few milliseconds that takes to pronounce a single fa, it will actually take longer. So what happens, this is more like a long vowel. Many times we have a long vowel, right? So in contrast to a short one, or a long oo, like in pool, in contrast to short oo, like a pull. So this is like this long vowel thing. We have long consonant, but eventually when it comes to representation, it is not shown as a long consonant. Rather, it's shown as a pair of the same consonant. It is like two of identical consonants side by side. So there it is a bit different than the vowel representation. Of course, vowel is something we cannot omit, and vowel has a little bit of different representation. But when it comes to this consonant business, yes, it varies in that sense. Okay. So this is the whole gemination part. Now, what is the reason behind it? Why the native speakers of English are pronouncing it differently, and here in India, the same word, when it is borrowed in Indian languages, of course, we don't have an equivalent word for the same term in India, so we borrowed it. Yes, most of the Indian languages use Africa that way. There is a phonotactic constraint that works behind it. So all languages have some phonotactic constraints. Phonotactic constraints are nothing but certain rules that we know when we learn or acquire a language, that these rules are present when you use, when you use the word, the sounds in that language. So and these phonotactic rules change from language to language. Of course, there are some universals, but well, the universals are always there, and then there are language specific rules, and that's the core of phonology. Phonology is language specific, whereas phonetics is universal, right? So this phonotactic rule, which is called the maximal onset principle, it is about how the consonants, or more precisely the intervocalic consonants, are sorted inside the word in different syllables. So by that, what we mean? We mean that if we have a structure like this, a vowel, then followed by a couple of consonants, and then followed by another vowel. Okay, so this is the word. Now, how we are breaking this word into different syllables? So MOP, the maximal onset principle, it works in such a way that where these intervocalic consonants are maximally assigned to a onset of the syllables in the conformity with the universal and language specific conditions. So these two consonants, MOP will try to push them to the onset. Now, as we know, in a typical syllable, you have an onset, you have rhyme, then you have the nucleus, and you have coda. So what will happen? These consonants will be sent to the onset position of the following syllable rather than the coda of the previous syllable. So this particular word, there are three possible ways to syllabify it, right? One is V, it is like just one vowel, which will be the nucleus, and then consonant, consonant, vowel. So this will be a syllable with a complex consonant, like play, P. So first syllable, first consonant, you can say pa, la, and then the vowel A. Okay. But the other two possibilities, V, C, C, V. But then what is happening here? This consonant is going to the coda of the first syllable, whereas the other consonant is going to the onset of the second syllable. But no, MOP does not like that. MOP likes that the consonants are maximally assigned to the onsets. So all consonants should be in the onset rather than the coda of the other syllable. So here it is the extreme bad scenario. Both the consonants are in the coda position. None is in the onset position of the second syllable. So this is not right. Let us take a real example. We have already seen Africa. Let us take some other example. Diploma. Okay, and this is the IPF representation. Diploma. So we have this PL cluster here, right, which is intervocalic. And what is happening? How many ways we can actually syllabify it? MOP would demand that the syllabification works like D first syllable, then plow, and then ma, rather than dip, then law, ma. No, this is not preferred. Although I don't know how many of you would like to try it yourself. Think of our way of pronunciation. Do we actually pronounce it more like diploma, or it is more like diploma? So like we try to make it more like dip, and then again we add a per here and make it diploma. And some people also can claim I pronounce it more like well, it is dip, then low and ma. No, there this whole thing differs. In Indian languages, MOP is not a strong phenomenon. Indian languages do not follow maximal onset principle. It may follow in some cases. Some people personally may, apply that because of their educational background and some other factors. But actually speaking, we do not use MOP that strongly. Well, the native speakers of English unknowingly, as a process of their first language acquisition, they adopt MOP, and it is almost without any fail, it gets applied. And that's why we get words like Africa. You can get it, you can hear it from the native speakers of English and not some, many of the European languages, whereas Indian English and other languages in India where we use words like this, we actually make the doubling to get an additional coda in the first syllable, of course keeping the onset cluster as it is there. Even this rule applies to words like Ebola, where it is pronounced as a, then bola. It is not eb, o, and la. No, this is not the way, but we make it here, Ebola. So this is the background of this kind of words, and this is not a very uncommon phenomenon. Like this whole gemination thing, it works at different level. If we look at Western languages, sorry, not Western languages, West Germanic languages. So if we look at the linguistic tree, West Germanic forms a large group of languages, and here West Germanic gemination is an established phenomenon. So what happens here is that a post short vowel consonant is a geminator. So after this short vowel like this, the consonants, they geminate in this West Germanic languages. So there are several examples in historical data in many of the contemporary work you can see, but this data is a historical data. Look at these languages like from Gothic, Scapian to West Germanic, like in the first layer you get Old Saxon, it is Scapian. In Old English it is Scapian, etc. So there is a proper gemination happening. Or like Old Norse Pramya. In Old High German, it becomes Fremen. So this is more, gemination. Then again from Gothic, Halia. In Old High German, it becomes Hella. And then you get a Lala cluster. So there are different clusters, and these clusters are forming the gemination. Gemination is a very fascinating thing actually, because of course these things now we can see these are in written form also, but actually these are such old historical development, you don't really have the actual pronunciation of them, but they are there in the traits that we see in the present form of these languages. Okay, so if we come to Indian languages, it is not only the borrowed words like Africa or diploma. Even in our own languages, we see gemination. For example, Professor Pramod Pandey's work, he has shown several geminations like Hindi word mitra, which is of course taken from Sanskrit. It has root in Sanskrit. In pronunciation, it becomes like this with a geminate cluster. I'm not a native speaker, so maybe a native speaker can pronounce it, but it is pronounced like myth. That actually, when you see it on a spectrogram, you can see that the is a more like nice cluster there, or another word like avashya, and finally it gets a gemination here. I have also collected few cases for Bangla where borrowed words like supreme become supreme in colloquial version of Bangla, or apluto, like inundated, becomes apluto. So from the written form to the spoken form, that additional per is coming there. Okay, and you can also see some other examples in Odia I have seen, but I couldn't give all the examples here. The question here is that how we can analyze this. I mean, what is the driving force to pick the geminated form and not the original form, not the basic form? Why in certain cases the gemination is actually happening? There are different models to explain this in linguistics. I mean, there are phonological models like the rule-based model can, of course, show it. But for this study, for today's talk, I thought I'll talk it in terms of the optimality theory. So optimality theory is a theoretical framework. Let us quickly go through how optimality theory actually works. By the way, Gulab, how much time do I have? Any? Okay. So
15 minutes.
okay, fine. Thank you.
Yeah.
So optimality theory is it's a theoretical framework, and what happens here, instead of the rules like there are several rules, like in English we can always say that if there is a oral sound followed by a nasal consonant, in actual pronunciation that oral vowel followed by a nasal consonant, that oral vowel changes to a nasal consonant, and we do not call it a nasal vowel, but we do not call it a nasal vowel, we call it nasalized one, because that following nasal one is influencing it. So when you say hen, that a sound is also being nasalized because of that following no sound, and this is like a rule, right? But in optimality theory or in OT, it is not rule based. Rather, here we talk in terms of constraints. So the surface forms like that hen sound, they reflect a resolution of conflicts between competing constraints. So we are assuming that several constraints that are competing with each other to allow or block certain particular pronunciations for the same input, same basis, same root, same base form. So the surface form becomes optimal if it incurs the least serious violation of the set of constraints, taking into all these constraints. So what happens if you look at this table below? We have a candidate A and candidate B. Let's say one of them is hen with that nasal A, and the other one is without the nasal. So one of them is winning. I mean, based on what kind of competition? There are three constraints. I can't say which constraint is what at this moment because this is just a general representation. But what is coming out that these stars are violating, these are violations. So candidate A is violating this candidate constraint 1, this one, and but this one 3 times, B 2 times, and so we have to see how many are being violated and what is the rank of this constraint. It is like constraint 1 is higher ranked than constraint 2, and constraint 2 is higher ranked than constraint 3, and so. So this is like a bit complex at the beginning, but as we move, you can find it a bit easier. This is a very quick background how OT developed. It was developed in 1990s by two prominent linguist and cognitive scientist, Alan Trains of Rutgers and Paul Smolensky of Johns Hopkins University. So they started this work as a connectionist model and then a connectionist theory. And the root of this optimality theory lies in the neural network research. So and in this connection, we should also keep in mind there is another theory of harmonic grammar, which is considered to be the predecessor of optimality theory. And optimality theory is actually considered a theory for phonology at large, but it has now been adapted for analysis in syntax and semantics. So it has some expanded usage. So very quickly, if I want to explain how optimality theory works, if you can imagine, in terms of academic institutes or universities campus, let's say there are two students, one of them live her life in terms of some rules, and the other one lives in terms of some preferences. So the first one has some rules like don't stay up late, where the second one has some preferences, of course. Like, of course, one preference is sleeping well, other preference is, well, partying with friends and so. Now, what happens if there is a situation like both of them get some message that there is some, party coming up, say birthday party. Now let's see how they make the decision. The decision is made this way. The first girl, the first student, checks her rules because mind that she runs her schedule and everything based on some rules, and the rule was don't stay up late. So hence the party is cancelled, right? So the rule is being applied there. While the second student, she doesn't have rules, but she has certain preferences. Preferences is something like they change. They can revert. They can change their position and so she has two preferences: sleeping and going to party. Sorry, two preferences: going to party and stay back and sleep. So she checks her preferences and give more preference to the first one, and hence this is a violation of the first and it is ruled out. So she is also staying back and sleeping. So eventually you see that we are getting the same result. The result does not change. The result is same. Only thing is how we are reaching to that particular decision. The second one, I would say, is the optimality theory model, whereas the first one is the rule-based model. And these things we can skip for the moment. We can very quickly look at how this whole thing works. We have two different sets of constraints. Faithfulness constraints, which will tell what you have in the input, you must have in the output also. Whereas the markedness constraint is not about input or output. It just says in the output, in the actual pronunciation, you must have these certain features, these certain elements. So the well-formedness of the output. So for example, all languages have oral vowels, but only some have nasal vowels. So if you have a specific constraint that nasal vowels are not allowed, so for a certain language, it has to be a bit lower ranked. Okay. So what happens when we actually apply these rules? The faithfulness constraints, they just check the input and the output. So input and output must correspond. While the markedness constraints, they directly gets applied to the output. They just check whether output is following or violating this particular constraint. So this is a very quick way to represent how this thing works. So the C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, these are candidates. This lex is the lexicon which is supplying the input. Gen is generating these possible pronunciations, possible in the sense. For Africa, if we take, there are three possible pronunciations: Africa and Africa, and then third one is Africa. So let's say C1, C2, and C3 are these three pronunciations. And which one is winning? Let's say if it is an Indian language, if it is, let's say, Hindi or Bangla or Odia or Assamese, all of them have to go through certain constraints, and each of them are going through the constraint and looking at how many violations are happening for that particular constraints. These violations are basically telling that this is not passing, this is not winning, so this is not the optimal candidate. Eventually, you see the C3 here is passing through all the constraints without any major violation, or even if there is violation, the violation is something manageable. This is optimal. So C3 is winning. So in Indian languages, Africa will be winning, following the general tendency of pronunciation. Okay. So this is how an typical OT system works. Okay, we'll again skip this. Anyone can look at it, how it works for like our very known example, like cats and dogs, how the cats is winning with an S at the end, the S sound, the voiceless sound, whereas the dogs is also winning in the same ranking. You say max IO, dep IO, agree voice, and ident IO voice. This is the ranking order, and the same ranking is here also. So here one is winning. So each of these constraints have certain demand and certain structure, and each of these candidates must fulfill whether it is violating or not. Okay, so let us pick one example from Indian language. So I have taken some examples from Bangla, and some of them are borrowed words, different types of borrowed words. Some are like borrowed from foreign words, some are taken from Indian words, I mean borrowed from inside India, like from Sanskrit, like Putra, then Shubhra, Apluto, etc. Whereas from English, supreme, supply, etc. And the pronunciation, actual pronunciation comes like supreme, supply, and so. But we also have to keep in mind the native Bangla words where the same type of gemination really does not work. You see here in supreme, there is purple gemination, but in supply, or even actually this is a better example. Look at supply. This is sup and then ply, whereas in supply, this gemination is not happening. It is sup and la. The reason, well, the reason is In optimality theory, when you say that when you get a ranking like this ranking is like the grammar of this language. This ranking will decide how each and every word will behave in this particular language. In OT, in the latter development of OT, it is accepted that even inside, within a language, there could be different layers. The layers are like this. Layers say that this is called the core periphery structure. In the core, you have certain types of word, the native words. Then you have certain borrowed words. This is another layer. And then you have another layer. Different layers behave differently. So they are like linguistic society within one language, different layers of that language. Okay. So these layers here are made based on the borrowing versus the native words. I've taken only one example from the Sanskrit borrowing words, that is Putra, because this example I think it is there in most of the Indo-Aryan languages, in Hindi, in Marathi, in Punjabi, many areas. So what is happening in case of Putra in the written form? In the underlying representation, it is this. Look at this ta and ra part, please. So the ta and ra, it's just a cluster which is being geminated when you are actually pronouncing it in Bangla. So putra becomes putro, and then putro is this additional ta thing. It is not getting added. Look at this. This is that ta. Okay, and this is the ra. So this alpha is actually being geminated. It is being shared by both the syllables. This syllable and this syllable. The onset is being shared with the coda of the previous one. So this is a representation for the geminated form. Now, when you come to the OT analysis, well, this the if it is not shared, it is violating syllable contact rule, that the t to r, it is actually rising. It should not rise. The sonority is rising. Here, this mu is representing that alpha. Here it is being shared, and it is of course violating another, but we come to that violation later. Here it is not violating, but one is deleted. The raw is deleted. So it is violating one constraint here. Here that here is there is another deletion. Here it is being geminated, but deletion. Here without gemination there is deletion. So these are all fatal violation with this exclamation mark, and these first one is gone here, third one is gone here, fourth one is gone here. So they kind of lost the competition. So only one that is left with is the second candidate, which is Putro, and this is the winning candidate. This is the optimal candidate. And this is basically giving us the theoretical foundation for such kind of gemination in at least one language. You will see this kind of gemination happening in many other languages. At the same time, very quickly, let me also tell that that other example, sapla, water lily, it is not being geminated. Then in the same language, in the same cluster, kind of same type of cluster, like paw followed by a liquid sound, thaw followed by a liquid sound. Well, there in one case there is gemination, in the other case there is no gemination. How it is possible? It is possible because they belong to different stratum, and in this we had to just move this syllable contact to the lowest possible ranking. It is called the lowest ranked constraint. So compared to this, it was here, and this was specifically important because it was deleting. It was the cause of the loss of the first candidate. It has moved to the end now, and hence this sapla with even this one this one is not the winner, but this one turns out to be the winning candidate. Okay, so basically our focus here is that Indian languages tend to geminate, particularly for the borrowed words. There are cases, of course, Bangla is one language. For example, in Hindi, you say the borrowing is happening in words like mitra, avashya, and such cases. But I mean, gemination is happening. Whereas in case of borrowed words, the gemination is happening, even overruling the phonotactic constraints of the source language. So those who study or look into the source and target language, this movement, the word borrowing, the the loan words, etc. They see that many times it gets nativized when you borrow a word. So while nativizing, it loses the phonotactic constraints like maximal onset principle, which is very strong in the native languages in the West Germanic group. And we have also very quickly, I'm sorry, but OT is a bit technical. I tried to make it simple, but again, if you did not get it completely, that is my inability. It is not the problem of OT actually. To understand, because OT is capable of explaining the strata-wise rule, not rule. I mean, in OT you do not talk about rules as such. So it talks about how for different stratum we can have different ranking. So for example, if you look at this ranking, this is a factorial typology where gemination in obstruent liquid clusters in Sanskrit borrowed words and other borrowed words, English words, the faithfulness and syllable contact dominates the complex onset and no gem. No gem just blocks any gemination. This is the lowest ranking because we want gemination to happen. Whereas in the native words, we don't want the gemination to happen, like sapla, that water lily example. It doesn't like the gemination. So we have to rule out that sapla, right? That example, we don't like, we don't want it. So here, no gem is higher ranked than syllable context. So this basically gives us two contrastive ranking pattern within the same language, which actually was not possible in the original framework of optimality theory, but later you might have noticed, maybe later, okay, we are at the end, but anyway, the Junko Ito and Armin Mester first introduced this concept in Japanese that you can have different strata for a language, and you can have different ranking system for that language. Okay, so this is where I would like to stop. Thank you so much for listening, because I know it is not easy to concentrate on something which is not maybe well explained without proper background or so. I tried to give some background, but hope you got some idea out of it. And this is a quick set of references. This is the paper I was talking about, Ito and Mester's core periphery structure of the lexicon. And this is an interesting and most common work on OT for learners. And well, there are some other works which I used for this talk, and some of the works are my own work. And here I stop for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir, for interesting talk. So now session is open for questions. So we got one question. The asker is unknown. Sir, it is interesting to know the explanation behind the pronunciation from an optimality perspective. But can we explain in brief how rule-based theory will explain the same? If no, then there is what's there in optimality which lacking in rule-based?
Okay, I would not say these two are really in competition, the rule-based model and optimality theory model. In that hostel student example, I was trying to tell that this is like looking at the same problem and maybe finally the same solution just from two different angles. And that's where even the title of this talk was put. See, rule-based model, of course, has its own advantage and disadvantage. So are there for OT. OT looks at it from the constraint-based model. So basically, it is trying to tell that our mind is working such a way that there are, out of so many possibilities, we are picking one possibility based on certain preferences for that particular language. Whereas the rule-based model does not deal with several possibilities. Rule-based model directly applies the rule to the input, to the base form, and it is like it generates the result. So it is more like you put the ingredients and put the stove on and it will cook it. So the ingredients and there is no like, maybe this is not the right example. So it is not taken in that sense. Of course, that phenomenon of Africa and the gemination can be explained through rule-based model. We can always say when these particular two types of sounds are in this vicinity, they are like for and for followed by r, for followed by l, and intervocalic position, they will follow this particular pattern. That there is one rule. But well, that is possible, but then you have to make several rules. OT can handle it with one set of constant, and that will be the advantage I can tell at this point. So if that answers.
I would request to attendees if you have any questions, so please type in the question box and I will read it out and speaker would be happy to answer.
Meanwhile, Somdev, as the others are typing the questions,
Yes, sir, please.
let me ask this question. You know, when you're talking about the Putra example,
Yes.
you have of course given the Bangla example, but then this word is available also in so many other Indian languages.
True.
And the result is the same, that instead of simply saying ta and ra combination, they stop at ta and the new syllable begins and they again begin with ta. So they
Yes.
geminate it.
Right.
Do you think this gemination explains why in Punjabi the same Sanskrit word changes into puttar?
Uttar, right, sir.
Otherwise, it is very difficult to explain why putra in Sanskrit should become puttar.
Okay, so this is really an interesting question and a very challenging one, of course. I am in I myself is living in Punjab for last several years, and this is not something very unknown. It is a typical tendency in Punjabi itself that it, rather than creating a gemination, it tends to break it. So basically, Punjabi it prefers more CV structure than in any place a complex onset. So even in Putro, that tra cluster remains there. So in Punjabi, what happens, it always prefers that if there is any consonant cluster, let us break it. Now that breaking happens in different ways, like the very common and perhaps famous and more popular example is how school or station is pronounced in Punjab. I mean, not of course by everyone, but the tendency is more like sakul or station kind of structure. So that Serta cluster is also breaking. But of course, sir, as you mentioned, that is not at the intervocalic position. That is more of at the word beginning. But my take or my quick answer to that question would be yes, Punjabi prefers more simple simple syllables without cluster than a cluster even with geminates. That is the only logical solution I could see here. But sir, if you have any other comment, I would be happy to.
No. This is a general question because there are several attendees who are from this part of the region, and sure, they would like to know more about the application of OT. But the
Yes, sir.
other question that I have is about the use of OT in teaching pronunciation in the foreign language class. While
Okay.
teaching the German, with teaching Dutch, teaching foreign languages, how can we use OT in a teaching class?
Okay, sir, OT, I see OT as a phonological theoretical framework. But if you look at the pronunciation, maybe as a linguist, we try to avoid that term, the right pronunciation. So it is not the right pronunciation, but the acceptable one by the
Yeah,
native
standard
pronunciation, standard one. So OT basically gives us the optimal choice. So among several possible pronunciation, and few of them are very much influenced by native language influence and some other influences. Eventually, what happens? It gives us the actual pronunciation that the native speakers train to, and OT gives us that set of consonants in that particular ranking, which always, for each and every case, give us the actual the native like pronunciation, the acceptable pronunciation. So what my point here is that once we reach to that ranking of constraints, it works fantastically, works like a computer program. So each input gives you the right output.
Correct.
Yes, that's the advantage that OT would give.
Okay, Dr. Gulabchand, other questions?
Sir, we had only one questions which have been answered by the speaker. Uh, is there any means we do not have any other question? So
Okay. If
I
you
would
have
like to
questions,
thank. No, actually, I remember that means when I was going for PhD interview, I wrote an proposal for OT and foreign language teaching, right? So, means as you asked the question about the foreign language and how we can collaborate the OT and foreign languages classes. So I remember those things, but I don't remember. I don't have any question regarding that. So I would like to thank Amity University, Aglis and ASLA department and Professor UN Singh and Director of ASLA for providing me such opportunities. And I would request Professor Singh to propose a vote of thanks to speaker.
yeah, I'm very happy that a very technical subject such as optimality theory could be explained in as simple language as possible. In fact, I was exchanging notes with Professor Sanjay Jha just now as you were speaking, and his comment is that the speaker is very lucid and very clear. It's a good talk. So I was also saying that linguists have the tendency to make simple things complicated, whereas what you have done is you've tried to make complicated things very simple. So that is one thing. But the other point I wanted to mention for those who have the temperament to understand is that just as in case of traditional syntax, purely TG syntax, transformational generative syntax, versus the relational grammar model, what happened is if you look at the transformational generative syntax, all the rules were based on assuming that the noun and the verb and the adjective and this clause and the phrases, they are the prime. Whereas in case of relational grammar, it is not those that are taken as prime. It is the relationship between noun and the verb and the noun and the adjective and the pronoun and the noun. it is the relationship which was taken as the basis, as the prime. So there was a quantum jump from the TG grammar model to the relational grammar model. Similarly, in case of OT, there's a quantum jump between the sound pattern of English type of, rule-based phonology to the constraint-based phonology in case of OT. So I would say it's a natural corollary that as from the TG, RG evolved, similarly from the rule-based phonology, OT evolved. So there's a very interesting parallel that I could easily see, which of course, for those who are into advanced theoretical considerations would be able to understand. But anyway, we are very happy that you could find time. And as we of course know that in IITs, all of you have been using the online teaching and online, classes very seriously, and even in difficult things are being explained online. But that's a different thing. Teaching in a classroom situation is different, and talking to a varied group of listeners, some of them into linguistics, some of them have understanding of linguistics, but application is somewhere else, like foreign language teaching. It's not easy for trying to hold attention of all these different kinds of listeners. So that you've done very well. So your training in Germany perhaps has helped in this case. Thank you,
Sir,
Dr.
thank you.
Somdev.
But I would also add here, your training and mentorship also did a lot of difference here.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Dr. Gulab. Over to you.
Yeah, so we are summing up the session now, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Gulab. Thank you so much. Thank you,
Yeah.
Professor Singh.
Right.
Narayan ji.